The late afternoon sun cast a dull, grayish light over the quiet street, muted and hazy, as though the city itself had tired of the day. Jamal Thompson sat alone on the cold stone steps of a closed-up storefront, his back pressed against the rough brick wall as he pulled his worn jacket closer to shield himself from the creeping autumn chill. The occasional murmur of footsteps and the distant hum of cars faded in and out, leaving him with a rare, if fragile, moment of peace. For Jamal, this small corner of the city was a sanctuary, a rare pocket of solitude in a world that seemed to shove him into every dark corner. But he knew, as he always did, that this peace wouldn't last. It never did. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed down the street, pulling Jamal's focus. His body instinctively tensed as he recognized the rigid, imposing frame of a police officer heading directly toward him. Jamal held his breath, his mind racing, knowing exactly how this encounter would likely go but clinging to the smallest hope that he was wrong. The officer stopped in front of him, a sneer barely hidden under the brim of his cap. "Thought you'd get comfortable here. Huh." Officer Walker's voice was sharp, slicing through the quiet with a chilling ease. Jamal met the officer's gaze, saying nothing at first, a silent resilience radiating from his hunched posture. Over the years, he had learned that silence could be a powerful shield, a way to keep some piece of himself protected, no matter how much others tried to break him. But something about Walker's presence felt different today. More dangerous. More mocking. "Taking a little nap, are we?" Walker's smirk widened, his words dripping with disdain. "I can't think of a better place for you to sleep it off." Jamal straightened, his hands pressed against his knees. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said quietly, keeping his voice calm despite the tightness in his chest. "Bothering anyone?" Walker's laughter echoed off the empty buildings. He glanced around as if looking for someone to witness his performance. "Just you sitting here is enough to bother me." Jamal drew a deep breath. "I'm not breaking any laws."
"Oh,
"Really?" Walker's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping into an icy sneer. "Maybe you don't get how this works. I decide what's breaking the law out here.
and you."
Sitting around looking like you look, that's all it takes." Jamal felt his fingers tighten into fists, a familiar heat of anger bubbling up inside. He forced himself to relax, taking another deep breath. "I'm just sitting here. I'm not doing anything wrong." Walker stepped forward, leaning in close enough that Jamal could see the gleam in his eyes, the twisted satisfaction he took in wielding his authority over someone powerless. "Let me spell it out for you. You don't belong here. This isn't some shelter. This is a decent neighborhood. And you're just dirt. You get me?" Jamal's jaw clenched, his patience unraveling with each poisoned word. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice taut but controlled. "I haven't done anything to you. Because I can." Walker replied, his words calm and venomous. "And because no one's going to do a thing about it. You think anyone's going to believe you?" His voice dropped lower, filled with malice. "I'm just doing my job. That's what they'll say." He leaned forward, his voice a sneering whisper. "You don't matter." Jamal's patience snapped. He shot up from the steps, his body tense with barely contained rage. "You don't know a damn thing about me." Walker's eyes gleamed with amusement, his confidence unwavering. "I know enough. You're just another nobody who thinks he's got some right to sit here, looking pathetic and wasting space." He took another step forward, close enough that Jamal could feel his hot breath. "I'll do whatever I need to keep this city clean." Jamal didn't move, his voice steady but laced with defiance. "If you think I'm scared of you, you're wrong." Walker's hand shot out, shoving Jamal hard enough that he stumbled, barely catching himself on the edge of the steps. But Jamal didn't look away. His pride, his dignity, these were all he had left. And he wouldn't let this man strip them away. Walker's expression darkened, his voice now low and dangerous. "You think I'm done?" Before Jamal could answer, Walker's boot swung forward, striking him squarely in the side. Pain exploded through Jamal's ribs as he collapsed to one knee, gasping for breath. But he forced himself to look up, meeting Walker's gaze with a defiance that wouldn't break. "You think anyone cares about what happens to you?" Walker sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing. Remember that." Jamal gritted his teeth, pain radiating through his body, but his gaze remained steady, unbroken. "You're wrong," he managed, his voice strained but unyielding.
For a fleeting moment,
Walker's mask cracked, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face before it vanished, replaced by anger. He took a step back, his hand hovering near his belt, ready to escalate further. But Jamal remained kneeling, his eyes fierce, refusing to give this man the satisfaction of breaking him. And that's when a voice cut through the tense silence. "Hey!" Both men turned. A tall man in a dark suit stood nearby, his expression severe, his gaze fixed on Walker with a mixture of anger and disbelief. His presence was out of place on this quiet street, but his tone held a confidence that was impossible to ignore. "What's going on here?" the man demanded, his voice sharp and unwavering. Walker's grip on Jamal loosened as he glanced dismissively at the newcomer. "Stay out of it. Just doing my job," he muttered, his words laced with irritation. The man took a step closer, his gaze unyielding. "Your job doesn't involve assaulting people on the street." Walker's face flushed, but he tried to hold his ground.
"Sir,
"I'd advise you to keep walking. This isn't your concern." "It is now," the man replied, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm not going to stand by and watch someone get treated like this."
Jamal,
Still struggling to steady his breath, locked eyes with the stranger through a haze of pain and disbelief. In that moment, something flickered inside him, a faint glimmer of hope. Fragile but real. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he wasn't completely alone. The officer turned back to Jamal, his face twisting in frustration. But Jamal could see it now, that slight shift. The crack in Walker's confidence. Maybe, just maybe, someone would see through the power he hid behind. The cold metallic click of the patrol car's door closing sent a shiver down Jamal's spine. As he sat handcuffed in the back seat, the city passed by outside in a blur of muted colors, distorted through the fingerprint-smeared glass. Pain still pulsed through his ribs from Walker's vicious kick. But that pain was nothing compared to the tight knot of anger and frustration sitting in his chest. He'd lost count of how many times he'd been treated like this, reduced to a problem, a nuisance, a face to ignore. Yet, today felt different. Just before Walker had shoved him into the car, Jamal had glimpsed the man in the suit, a stranger who had stood up, unafraid, against an officer drunk with authority. The look in that man's eyes had been fierce, unyielding. Somehow, even after years of being told he was invisible, that stranger had seen him. The car jerked to a stop outside the station, and Walker yanked Jamal roughly from the back seat, his grip tight and uncompromising. "Let's go,"
he barked,
his tone cold and filled with annoyance. Jamal could feel the officer's frustration radiating with every movement, and the knowledge that Walker was rattled, even just a little, stirred something unfamiliar inside him. It was hope, small but potent. They moved through the station's dim hallways, the walls echoing with the indifferent hum of distant voices, fluorescent lights casting a harsh, sterile glow over everything. The air smelled faintly of bleach and sweat, and every step echoed with a hollow sense of isolation. Jamal's past encounters with this place had always felt dehumanizing, as though he were just another number, processed and forgotten. But this time, as they walked, he felt the faint but steady drumbeat of something else, a chance, maybe, for something different. Walker shoved him into a holding cell, the door slamming shut with a metallic clang. Jamal stumbled but quickly steadied himself, turning back to face the officer. Walker lingered just outside the bars, arms crossed, a smug grin playing at the corners of his mouth. "You really thought you could mouth off to me and walk away? Huh," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension.
Jamal didn't respond,
Instead, he met Walker's gaze, unblinking, refusing to let the officer's words cut as deeply as they had before. Maybe he wasn't entirely alone anymore. As Walker turned and left, his footsteps fading down the hall, Jamal was left alone in the small, cold cell. He leaned against the wall, the chill of the concrete seeping through his clothes, and closed his eyes. His thoughts drifted back to the man in the suit, the stranger who had seen everything, who had challenged Walker and promised he wouldn't walk away. That brief, heated exchange outside still echoed in his mind. Could that man truly be different? A few minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed again, drawing Jamal's attention. He looked up, and there, standing outside the cell door, was the man in the suit. His expression was serious, but his eyes held a warmth, a kind of intensity that felt like a lifeline. "Jamal Thompson?" the man asked, his voice low but steady. Jamal nodded, unsure what to say, the mixture of disbelief and cautious hope making his voice catch. "My name's Daniel Reed," the man continued, his voice calming, unwavering.
"I saw what happened out there."
"And I want to help you." Jamal's gaze shifted, studying Daniel's face, searching for any hint of pity or obligation. He found none. Instead, he saw a sincerity, a quiet resolve that he hadn't encountered in anyone else for a long, long time.
"Why?"
Jamal asked, his voice rough, the word carrying the weight of years spent being ignored.
"Dismissed."
Treated as invisible. Daniel's expression softened, his eyes steady. "Because what happened to you is wrong. And because people like Walker think they're untouchable. They think they can get away with treating others like they're less than human. I'm not going to stand by and let that happen." The simplicity of his words, the honesty behind them, struck a chord deep within Jamal. For so long, he had been defined by others, reduced to a stereotype, pushed into the shadows. But here was someone who saw him, who recognized his humanity and was willing to stand with him. "I don't know how to thank you," Jamal said, his voice barely a whisper, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Daniel shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. But if you're willing, I want to help you make this right. I have a lawyer, Sandra Mills, one of the best. She's experienced with cases like this, and she knows the law inside out. If you're ready to stand up to Walker, I'll make sure you're not alone in this." A surge of emotion rushed through Jamal, a mixture of fear, anger, and a glimmer of strength that he hadn't felt in years. The thought of going up against Walker and the system that protected him was terrifying.
"Yes."
But he knew he couldn't walk away.
"Not now."
"Not with this chance." "I'm in," Jamal said, his voice firm, laced with a resolve that surprised even him. "I'm tired of running, tired of being treated like I don't matter." Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips.
"Good."
"We'll go through this together. Walker won't have the final say. You deserve justice."
"Jamal."
Jamal's heart pounded with a renewed rhythm, each beat echoing with a newfound determination. Daniel's presence, his belief in Jamal's right to stand up and fight, ignited a spark that had nearly gone cold. As they walked out of the station, side by side, the weight of years spent in isolation seemed to lift, replaced by something he had almost forgotten, a sense of purpose, a belief that his voice, his life, mattered. The next morning, Jamal found himself seated in an unfamiliar office, his gaze moving restlessly around the room. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the polished wood desk and the organized stacks of papers. He felt out of place in his worn clothes, sitting stiffly in a chair that was far more comfortable than anything he'd been accustomed to in recent years. The man who'd brought him here, Daniel Reed, sat across from him, exuding calm and focus. "Thank you for meeting with me, Jamal," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I know it's been a lot to take in, but I want you to know you're not alone in this." Jamal nodded, though disbelief lingered in his expression. This all felt surreal, the idea that anyone, let alone a man like Daniel, would go out of their way to help him. For so long, he'd been just another invisible face, drifting through the city, surviving on the edges.
But now,
For the first time, he felt seen. A knock at the door pulled Jamal from his thoughts. And, a moment later, a woman stepped into the room. She was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, her dark hair pulled back in a neat twist. Her expression was one of determination, her gaze steady as she approached. "Jamal," Daniel said, standing to introduce her. "This is Sandra Mills. She's one of the best attorneys I know, and she's agreed to represent you." Sandra extended her hand, and Jamal shook it, feeling the firmness of her grip. "It's nice to meet you, Jamal," she said, her tone both warm and professional. "Daniel's filled me in on what happened, and I want you to know I take cases like this very seriously." Jamal took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he absorbed her words. There was a strength in her voice, a quiet confidence that reassured him in ways he hadn't expected. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but sincere. I don't know if I'm ready for something like this, but I know I'm tired of letting people like Walker get away with it." Sandra gave him a nod of understanding. "That's why we're here. Cases like yours are difficult, but they're important. They remind people that no one is above the law, no matter how much they believe otherwise." She motioned for him to sit, and Jamal settled back down. His gaze locked onto her as she opened a folder filled with notes and documents. "The first thing we need is your full account of what happened,"
Sandra said,
her pen poised over her notepad. "Every detail matters, no matter how small." Jamal hesitated, the memory of Walker's sneering face and brutal treatment still fresh in his mind. But he took a steadying breath, forcing himself to recall each painful detail. He started from the beginning, describing how he'd been sitting outside, just trying to find a place to rest without bothering anyone. "He came up to me out of nowhere," Jamal began, his voice low but steady. "Didn't even ask what I was doing, he just went straight into telling me I didn't belong there, that I was dirt." The words felt heavy, loaded with years of similar experiences, of being dismissed and degraded for no reason other than existing in spaces others deemed off-limits. Sandra nodded, jotting down notes. "And when he began to escalate, did he give you any reason?" Jamal shook his head, anger sparking in his chest as he remembered Walker's sneering face. "No reason. He just decided I was in his way, I guess. He didn't care what I was doing, he just saw someone he thought was an easy target." Sandra's eyes darkened slightly, her expression hardening. "And then, he kicked me," Jamal continued, his voice tightening as he relived the moment. "I was on the ground, and he looked down at me like I was less than human, like I was just something to step on." Sandra paused, letting his words hang in the air, a quiet silence heavy with anger and grief. She nodded, her pen moving swiftly across her notepad. "We're going to make sure he answers for this,
Jamal.
He can't just kick someone to the curb and think no one will hold him accountable." Daniel leaned forward, his voice soft but full of conviction. "Jamal, I know this isn't easy. You're putting yourself in a difficult position by going against someone like Walker. The department will defend him. They'll make you out to be the problem, the one at fault. Are you ready for that?" Jamal's gaze dropped to his hands, fingers fidgeting as he processed Daniel's words. He had been beaten down, told time and time again that his existence was a problem, that he didn't belong. But here, in this room, surrounded by people who were ready to fight for him, he felt a spark of courage begin to grow. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firmer than before. "I'm tired of feeling like I have to hide. If this is what it takes to be seen, then I'll do it." Sandra gave him a small, approving smile. "That's the spirit. But I want you to be prepared.
Jamal.
They'll try to discredit you, bring up anything in your past that can paint you in a negative light. You'll need to be strong and stay focused on why you're doing this." Jamal nodded, steeling himself as her words settled over him. He had faced worse. He had weathered storms no one else had seen.
And now,
With Sandra and Daniel beside him, He was beginning to believe that he could weather this one.
2.
Daniel placed a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. We're with you every step of the way. Whatever they throw at us, we'll handle it. This fight is bigger than just us. It's about showing that no one should be able to treat another human being the way Walker treated you. The gravity of Daniel's words settled in Jamal's chest, filling him with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. For so long, he had been invisible, a shadow drifting through the city.
But now,
He had a voice, and he would use it. They spent the rest of the afternoon strategizing, planning each step with meticulous care. Sandra laid out the details of the legal process, explaining how they would gather evidence, interview witnesses, and build a case that would make it impossible for Walker to escape justice. As the hours passed, Jamal felt his fear give way to determination, his doubts replaced by a steely resolve. When he finally left the office, the evening air felt cool against his skin, a refreshing contrast to the stuffy, tension-filled room he had left behind. Daniel walked beside him, a quiet, steady presence that reminded Jamal he wasn't alone. "Thank you, Daniel," Jamal said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know why you're helping me, but thank you." Daniel smiled, his eyes kind. "You don't need to thank me.
Jamal.
This isn't just about helping you. It's about standing up to people like Walker and reminding them that no one is above the law. If we can make a difference, even for one person, it's worth it." As they parted ways, Jamal felt the weight of what lay ahead. It would be a difficult journey, one filled with obstacles and resistance. But he was ready. He was no longer a nameless face, a shadow in the background. He was a man with a voice, and he would make it heard. For the first time in years, Jamal walked with his head held high, a flicker of hope burning bright within him. The battle had only just begun, but he was ready to face it, step by step, with strength and resilience that had been born from years of survival. This time, he would not be pushed aside. A week had passed since Jamal first sat in Daniel's office, recounting his story with quiet determination.
Now,
As he made his way back to that same office, he felt a mixture of anxiety and purpose. The world outside still felt the same, familiar, bustling, indifferent, but he was different. He was no longer just passing through.
he had a reason to be here.
A reason to be seen. Sandra greeted him in the waiting area, her professional composure softened by a welcoming smile. "Jamal,
Come on in.
we've got a lot to go over today." He followed her into a conference room where Daniel was already seated, stacks of papers and files spread out on the table before him. The sight was overwhelming. Evidence, statements, the building blocks of a case that felt bigger than Jamal himself. It was strange to see his experience, his pain, laid out so plainly in ink and paper. Yet there it was. And it was real. Sandra motioned for him to sit down. "All right.
Jamal.
Today we're going to start putting everything in order. We're going to look at the legal process ahead. But more importantly, I want you to know exactly what we're up against." Jamal nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I'm ready." Daniel leaned forward, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Good. This isn't going to be easy. But remember, each step we take brings us closer to justice." Sandra opened a file, her expression growing serious. "First, we're submitting a formal complaint to the police department. This will initiate an internal investigation into Officer Walker's conduct, and we're hoping it will pressure the department to take action. But the police will almost certainly defend him. They'll try to dismiss this as a misunderstanding. They'll downplay what he did and try to make you look like the troublemaker." Jamal looked at her, feeling a chill run down his spine. "So, they're going to try and make this my fault?" Sandra nodded, a hint of sympathy in her gaze.
Yes, Jamal.
"They'll dig into your past, question your intentions, and try to make it seem like you were the one at fault. It's all part of their defense strategy." Daniel's hand rested on Jamal's shoulder, steady and grounding. "But we're not going to let them twist this. We'll fight every step of the way." Jamal took a deep breath, feeling a mix of fear and anger. The thought of his life being scrutinized, his mistakes laid bare for the world to see,
Was daunting.
but then he thought of Walker's smug expression, the way he had looked at Jamal like he was nothing. That memory burned away his hesitation. "I don't care what they say about me," he said firmly. "I know the truth, and I want people to know it too." Sandra gave him an approving nod, flipping to a new page in her notes. "All right. The next step is gathering evidence. We have Daniel's statement as a witness, and we're going to interview anyone else who may have seen what happened. We'll also gather any complaints that have been filed against Walker in the past." Jamal's eyes widened. "You mean there might be other people he's done this to?" Sandra's gaze hardened. "From what we've heard, it's likely. Officers like Walker don't usually act out of the blue. There's often a history of misconduct that's been overlooked." A surge of anger mixed with a renewed sense of purpose filled Jamal. The thought that Walker could have hurt others, that he might have been unchecked for so long, made his resolve solidify even further. "So, we're not just doing this for me," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "We're doing this for everyone he's wronged." Daniel nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes.
Exactly. Jamal.
"This case is bigger than one incident. It's about standing up to a pattern of abuse, making it clear that people like Walker can't keep getting away with it." Sandra slid a document across the table, her eyes meeting Jamal's. "I'm going to need you to sign this. It's a release that allows us to represent you and gives us access to any relevant records. I'll also need you to prepare for media attention. This case is likely going to attract public interest, and reporters may reach out to you." Jamal hesitated, his mind racing. The thought of being in the public eye was daunting, but he knew that staying quiet had never done him any good. If speaking out was what it took, then he would do it. He picked up the pen, his fingers steady as he signed his name. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." Sandra smiled, a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. "That's good to hear, because this is only the beginning." For the next hour, they walked him through the legal steps, detailing every part of the process. Jamal listened intently, absorbing every word. He had been told to keep his head down for so long that this sudden invitation to rise up, to fight, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. As they wrapped up, Sandra leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "Jamal, I want you to remember something. This isn't just about proving Walker's guilt. It's about restoring your dignity. It's about showing that your life, your existence, isn't something people can just dismiss or trample on." The words resonated deeply, filling Jamal with a sense of validation he hadn't felt in years. He was more than the labels others placed on him. He was a man who mattered. The meeting ended, and Daniel offered to walk him out. As they moved through the hallway, Daniel glanced at Jamal, his expression contemplative. "You know, this case, it's a fight worth having. No one should be made to feel the way Walker made you feel. And if this can help prevent others from going through the same thing, then it's a fight worth winning." Jamal looked down, his voice soft but resolute. "I've spent so much time just trying to survive, trying not to be noticed. But now, I want to be seen. I want people to know who I am and what I stand for." They reached the building's entrance, the evening air cool and sharp as they stepped outside. Jamal took a deep breath, looking out at the city, feeling a new sense of belonging. This was his city too. He had as much right to be here as anyone else. And with Sandra and Daniel beside him, he felt a growing belief that he could finally claim his place. Daniel extended a hand, his gaze steady. "We're with you,
Jamal.
no matter what." Jamal shook his hand, feeling the solid weight of it, a connection that felt real. For the first time, he felt the walls he'd built around himself begin to crumble, replaced by something stronger, trust, and maybe even hope. As he walked away, his steps felt lighter, his heart steadier. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was a man fighting for something real, something that mattered. And as he moved through the evening streets, he carried with him a sense of purpose that made the city seem brighter, more welcoming. This was just the beginning, but it was a beginning filled with strength, with courage, and with the belief that, finally, his voice would be heard. Jamal sat alone in the dimly lit cafe, nursing a cup of coffee as he glanced anxiously at the door. His nerves felt like they were on fire, the weight of the lawsuit pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew what it meant to take on someone like Officer Walker. There would be backlash, whispers about his past, even strangers assuming he was just out to stir trouble. But he also knew he couldn't walk away now. This was his fight, and he was determined to see it through. The bell above the door chimed, and Jamal looked up as Sandra walked in, a file tucked under her arm and a look of fierce purpose in her eyes. She spotted him, and her expression softened into a smile as she approached the table. "Jamal," she greeted, sliding into the seat across from him. "I have some news, and I think it's going to help our case in a big way." Jamal's eyebrows lifted in curiosity, and Sandra opened the file in front of her. "I've been contacted by an officer, someone within the police department who knows Walker personally and is willing to speak up." Jamal's heart pounded at the news. "You're serious? Another officer is willing to testify against him?" Sandra nodded, a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes.
Yes.
"This officer,
Grant,
says he's witnessed Walker's behavior for years, and he's ready to go on record about the misconduct he's seen."
Jamal.
This could be exactly what we need to prove Walker's pattern of abuse. Jamal's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. For so long, he had felt like it was him against an entire system, as though he were fighting a giant with nothing but his own hands.
But now,
Knowing that someone from within was willing to stand beside him, it was like a lifeline he hadn't dared to hope for. "When can we meet him?" Jamal asked, his voice tinged with hope and urgency. "Soon," Sandra assured him. "Grant wants to make sure his statement is solid before he goes on record. He knows there will be consequences for speaking out, but he's committed to doing what's right. He said he's tired of watching Walker get away with things that should have ended his career a long time ago." Jamal's hands tightened around his coffee cup, a surge of gratitude welling up inside him. He understood what it took to stand up against someone in power, the kind of courage that required. "I don't know what to say. I never thought someone from his own side would actually." Sandra placed a reassuring hand over his. "This is a big deal.
Jamal.
Officer Grant is risking a lot by coming forward, but that only strengthens our case. And it shows that even within a flawed system, there are people who want to make a difference." As they spoke, the door to the cafe opened again, and a tall man in a police uniform walked in, his posture tense and his expression guarded. He scanned the room until his gaze landed on Sandra and Jamal, and he hesitated, as though gathering his courage, before walking over to their table. "Officer Grant?" Sandra asked, standing up to shake his hand. He nodded, his face hard but his eyes flickering with determination.
Yes.
"That's me." He glanced at Jamal, a hint of apology in his gaze. "Mr. Thompson, I know what you went through was wrong, and I should have spoken up a long time ago, but I'm here now, and I want to help." Jamal looked up at him, a mixture of gratitude and respect in his expression. "Thank you. I know this can't be easy for you." Grant shook his head, a trace of guilt flashing across his face. "I've seen too much to stay silent any longer. Walker's been getting away with things for years, and each time, I thought maybe he'd change or that someone else would report him, but that never happened.
And now,
Seeing your case go public, it made me realize that I can't keep turning a blind eye." Sandra nodded encouragingly, gesturing for him to sit down. "Officer Grant, we appreciate your willingness to come forward. Your testimony will be crucial in showing that Walker's actions were not an isolated incident." As they settled into their seats, Grant took a deep breath. "I've worked with Walker for years. He has a reputation, especially when it comes to dealing with minorities. He's always had a chip on his shoulder, and there were times when he took things too far, harassing people, using excessive force, making arrests that didn't hold up in court. But he always had a way of getting out of it. Either his superiors covered for him, or the department brushed it off as him just doing his job. Jamal clenched his fists, anger boiling inside him as he listened to Grant's words. It was one thing to suffer alone, but hearing that others had been harmed by Walker, that this had been allowed to continue for years, made his resolve even stronger. "Why now?" Jamal asked, his voice heavy with curiosity. "Why come forward now after all this time?" Grant looked down, his face shadowed with regret. "Because I was wrong to stay silent. I convinced myself that it wasn't my place to interfere, that I'd lose my job if I spoke out.
But seeing the impact on you,
Seeing the hurt he's caused, it made me realize that my silence was just as damaging as his actions. It's time someone held him accountable." Sandra's face softened, and she gave him an encouraging nod. "Officer Grant, your courage in coming forward will make a difference. We'll include your statement as part of our case. And I promise you, we're going to fight this with everything we've got." Grant gave a solemn nod, his gaze steady. "Thank you. It's about time Walker learned that he's not untouchable." As they continued discussing the case, a quiet sense of solidarity filled the table. For the first time, Jamal felt a sense of power, a belief that they could truly make a difference. They weren't just a man and his lawyer going up against a system. They were a team, strengthened by allies who were willing to risk everything for the truth. When Grant finally stood to leave, Jamal extended his hand, and they shook in mutual respect. "Thank you, Officer Grant," Jamal said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I won't forget what you're doing." Grant gave him a faint smile. "Neither will I, Jamal. And I hope that this is just the beginning of real change." As Grant walked out, Jamal felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. He turned to Sandra, a newfound determination in his gaze. "Let's do this. Let's make sure that Walker and anyone like him understand they can't treat people this way anymore." Sandra smiled, a glint of fierce pride in her eyes. "That's exactly what we're going to do.
Jamal.
And with every person who joins us, our voice gets stronger." They left the cafe together, stepping out into the bustling city street where the noise of cars and chatter filled the air. But to Jamal, the world felt quieter somehow, as though he had finally found his place in it. For so long, he had been pushed to the edges, made to feel like his life didn't matter.
But now,
Standing beside Sandra, backed by allies like Daniel and Grant, he felt like a man with a purpose, a voice that could no longer be silenced. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had been knocked down and forced to stand up alone. Together, they would make sure that voices like his would be heard, loud and clear. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would be those who tried to stop them. But they had something stronger than fear on their side. They had truth. They had justice.
and
Finally, they had each other. The courthouse loomed large and imposing as Jamal approached it, his heart thudding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The morning light cast long shadows across the marble steps, and as he climbed them, each step felt heavier than the last. This was the moment he had been building toward, but the weight of what was at stake pressed down on him, filling him with both fear and resolve. Sandra walked beside him, calm and focused, a reassuring presence in the midst of his tension. Daniel followed just behind them, his face steady, radiating quiet support. Jamal drew a deep breath, gathering his strength.
today,
He would face Officer Walker, not as the man who had been kicked on a deserted street, but as a man determined to reclaim his dignity and his place in the world. The courtroom was filled with a hushed tension, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Reporters and onlookers filled the benches, their faces turned toward the front of the room, their eyes fixed on the stand where Jamal would soon speak. He took his seat beside Sandra, his gaze briefly locking onto Walker, who sat across the room with his lawyer, his face unreadable but his eyes cold. Sandra leaned over, her voice soft but firm. "Remember, Jamal, stick to your truth. Don't let them shake you." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words anchor him, His truth was all he had, and he was ready to tell it. The trial began with opening statements, each lawyer painting their version of the story. Sandra's voice was calm and clear as she described Jamal's experience, her words a quiet but powerful accusation of Walker's abuse of power. She spoke with a steady conviction that made every listener sit up and pay attention, the courtroom hanging on to each word. Then it was Walker's lawyer's turn. He was smooth,
Polished.
every inch the defense attorney with an easy charm and an assured tone. He spoke of Walker as a dedicated officer, a man who had served his community faithfully, and tried to paint Jamal as a troublemaker, a man with a history of defiance against authority. The words stung, but Jamal clenched his fists, refusing to let them get to him. When the opening statements were over, Sandra turned to him, her eyes filled with encouragement. "It's your turn now.
Jamal.
Just remember, this is your story. You own it." Jamal took a deep breath, standing and making his way to the witness stand. The courtroom felt even larger from up here. The eyes of strangers, reporters, and even Officer Walker's steely gaze fixed on him. But he steadied himself, drawing from the strength that had carried him through so much. Sandra approached him, her gaze calm and reassuring. "Jamal, can you tell us what happened that day? In your own words." Jamal cleared his throat, his voice low but steady as he began. "I was sitting on the steps of a clothes shop. I wasn't doing anything, just trying to stay out of the way. That's when Officer Walker came up to me." He continued, his words gaining strength as he recounted every detail. He described Walker's taunts, the mocking tone, the dehumanizing words that had cut deeper than any physical blow. He spoke of the kick that had sent him to the ground, the pain radiating through his ribs, the humiliation of being treated as though he were less than human. With each word, he felt the weight of his experience lifted, his voice reaching out to everyone in that room, demanding they hear him. Sandra's face remained calm but intense, her focus never wavering. "Jamal, can you tell us how you felt in that moment?" Jamal paused, gathering his thoughts. "I felt invisible," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, like I was just dirt under his boot, like my life didn't matter. A hush fell over the courtroom, his words striking a chord that resonated with everyone present. Sandra nodded, her gaze softening as she took a step back. "Thank you,
Jamal.
No further questions." Jamal returned to his seat, feeling a sense of relief mixed with tension as the defense attorney rose. The man's face held a smooth, practiced smile as he approached, a hint of calculation in his eyes. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his tone almost patronizing, "would you say that you have had difficulties with authority figures in the past?" Jamal narrowed his eyes, seeing through the thinly veiled attempt to shift blame. "I've had experiences. Yes. But that doesn't give anyone the right to treat me like I'm less than human." The attorney's smile tightened. "Of course. But wouldn't you say that perhaps your attitude played a role in escalating this situation?" Jamal's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice calm, refusing to let this man's tactics rattle him. "I was sitting quietly when Walker approached me. He made it clear from the start that he saw me as a problem." The attorney's smile faded slightly, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He pressed on, trying to suggest that Jamal's defiance had invited Walker's aggression. But each time, Jamal answered firmly, his responses revealing the truth of Walker's cruelty. Finally, the attorney relented, returning to his seat with a tight expression. Jamal took a steadying breath as Sandra gave him a slight nod, her expression proud. He had faced down the scrutiny and held his ground. His truth remained unshaken. The next witness was Officer Grant. Jamal watched as the officer took the stand, his posture tense, but his gaze steady. Sandra approached him, her tone respectful but firm. "Officer Grant, can you tell us about your experience working with Officer Walker?" Grant hesitated, glancing briefly at Jamal before answering. "I've worked with Walker for over 6 years. I've seen him target people, particularly minorities. He has a way of escalating situations. There have been complaints filed against him, but nothing ever came of them." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom as Grant continued, detailing specific incidents where Walker had used excessive force or shown unwarranted hostility. Jamal felt a swell of gratitude as he listened, knowing that Grant's courage to speak up had added strength to his case. The defense attorney attempted to discredit Grant, questioning his loyalty to the department and suggesting he was motivated by personal issues with Walker. But Grant held firm, each answer revealing more of Walker's abusive pattern. When it came time for closing statements, Sandra stood with a calm confidence that silenced the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began,
her voice steady.
"What you've heard here today is not just a story about one man's experience. It's a story about power and how it can be misused. Officer Walker abused his authority to dehumanize a man who was doing nothing more than sitting quietly, simply existing. He saw Jamal Thompson as less than human, as someone he could kick and taunt without consequence." She paused, letting her words sink in. But this is not just about Officer Walker and Jamal Thompson. This is about every person who has ever been told they don't belong, who has ever been treated as though their life has less value.
Today,
you have the power to say that this stops here. The jury sat in attentive silence, Sandra's words leaving a weight that hung heavily in the room. The defense attorney's closing statement was polished and practiced, but it lacked the conviction of Sandra's truth. He tried to frame Walker as a dedicated officer, simply doing his duty. But the testimonies had already cast doubt on that narrative. When the jury retired to deliberate, Jamal sat beside Sandra and Daniel, his heart pounding. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally, the jury returned. Jamal's breath caught as he looked at the foreperson, waiting for the words that would define his future. The foreperson cleared his throat, glancing down at the paper in his hands.
"We,
the jury, find the defendant, Officer Bryce Walker, guilty of all charges." A wave of relief and vindication washed over Jamal, filling him with a sense of justice he hadn't dared to hope for. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Jamal barely heard them. All he could feel was the weight of freedom settling over him, a release from the chains of invisibility and humiliation that had bound him for so long. Sandra smiled at him, pride shining in her eyes. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his expression one of quiet triumph. As they left the courthouse together, Jamal felt lighter, as though he were finally free to walk with his head held high. He had fought not only for himself, but for every person who had been silenced, who had been told they didn't matter. He stepped out into the afternoon light, the city buzzing with life around him.
But today,
he felt truly part of it, a man who had faced his fears, claimed his voice, and won his dignity back. For the first time in years, he felt whole. No longer just a forgotten face. He was a man who had been seen, heard,
and,
most importantly, believed. The fight was over, but his journey was just beginning. The verdict echoed in Jamal's mind like a drumbeat, guilty on all charges. The words had reverberated through the courtroom, shattering the walls of doubt and fear he'd built around himself. As he walked out of the courthouse, a rush of emotions flooded him. Relief,
joy,
vindication.
For the first time,
he felt something profound. He mattered.
His story mattered.
A crowd of supporters, reporters, and onlookers had gathered on the courthouse steps, their voices blending into a low hum. Sandra and Daniel flanked him, their presence grounding him in the chaos of flashing cameras and shouting journalists. "Mr. Thompson, what do you hope will come out of this case?" a reporter called out, pushing a microphone toward him. Jamal paused, taking in the crowd. His gaze steadied as he looked at the people gathered around him, many of whom were watching with quiet respect, some even with admiration. He knew this was his moment to be heard, not just by the people in front of him, but by anyone who had ever been made to feel invisible, worthless, or out of place. "I hope," he said, his voice strong and unwavering, "that no one else has to go through what I went through. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that needs to be accountable to the people it's meant to serve." It's about dignity, respect, and the right to exist without fear. He looked directly into the cameras, feeling the weight of his words ripple through the crowd. I stood up because I was tired of being pushed down. But I didn't do it alone. People like Sandra Mills and Daniel Reed stood with me. This case is proof that no one is truly alone, that we can all make a difference when we decide to stand together. The crowd erupted in applause, and Jamal felt a sense of warmth wash over him, a shared solidarity, a belief that change was possible, that justice could reach places he had once thought were out of its grasp. As the crowd began to disperse, Daniel placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, his face filled with quiet pride. You did well,
Jamal.
The whole city is going to hear that message. Jamal nodded, a smile touching his lips. Thank you, Daniel. I never thought I'd make it here. I owe a lot to you and Sandra. You don't owe us anything, Sandra replied, her tone firm but warm. This was your fight. We just gave you the tools. You were the one who had the courage to see it through. They walked down the steps together, away from the courthouse and into the open air of the city. As they made their way down the busy street, Jamal was surprised to feel people turning toward him with nods of recognition, a few offering quiet words of encouragement as they passed. The city, which had once felt so isolating, so vast and indifferent, now felt like a place where he belonged. Later that evening, they gathered at Daniel's office, surrounded by the people who had supported Jamal throughout the trial.
Sandra,
Daniel, Officer Grant, and a few others sat around the room, the atmosphere a blend of exhaustion and triumph. Sandra raised a glass, her eyes bright with pride. To Jamal, a man who fought for his rights and won. You've not only made history, but you've also inspired others to stand up for what's right. A chorus of cheers filled the room, and Jamal felt his heart swell with gratitude. The faces around him had become more than just allies. They were friends, people who had seen him, believed in him, and fought beside him. As the night went on, Jamal found himself in conversation with Officer Grant, the officer who had risked his career to testify against Walker. The two men shared a quiet moment, their words carrying the weight of the journey they had shared. Thank you for standing up, Jamal said, his voice filled with sincerity. I know it couldn't have been easy for you. Grant shook his head, a thoughtful expression on his face. It was the right thing to do. I stayed silent for too long. People like Walker need to be held accountable. And this case, it's a wake-up call. For everyone. They fell silent for a moment, both men reflecting on the impact of what they had achieved. Jamal knew that Grant's choice to come forward had changed everything. It was a reminder that change, however slow, was possible, even within a system that had been stacked against him. As the evening wore on, Daniel approached Jamal with a thoughtful look. There's something I'd like to discuss with you.
Jamal.
It's an opportunity, if you're interested. Jamal raised an eyebrow, intrigued. An opportunity? Daniel nodded, his expression both encouraging and serious. I know you've been through a lot, and I can only imagine how difficult it's been. But seeing your strength, your determination, it's rare. I think my company could use someone like you. Someone who understands resilience, who knows what it means to stand up and fight. Jamal felt a mixture of surprise and hope as Daniel's words sank in. He had spent so long on the edges of society, barely scraping by, never imagining that a stable, meaningful job could be in his future. I'd love that, Jamal replied, his voice filled with emotion. I want to do something that matters, to make a difference. Daniel extended his hand, his gaze steady. Then welcome to the team, Jamal. As they shook hands, a surge of purpose filled Jamal's chest. This wasn't just an ending, it was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild his life with people who believed in him. In the weeks that followed, Jamal settled into his new role at Daniel's company, learning the ropes and finding his place within a team that valued him for who he was. Each day brought new challenges, but he faced them with a quiet confidence, a belief that he had earned his place here. The city felt different now, less daunting, more familiar. He was no longer a faceless man on the street, but someone with a voice, a purpose, and a future. One afternoon, as he walked through a neighborhood he hadn't visited in years, he saw people looking at him with quiet nods of recognition. He had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the most overlooked people could stand up and be counted. As he passed by a group of young men, one of them stepped forward, offering a hand. "You're Jamal, right? The guy who took on Walker?" Jamal smiled, shaking his hand. "That's me." The young man's gaze held admiration, and he nodded. "You gave people hope. You showed that we don't have to take this kind of treatment. We can fight back." Jamal felt a warmth spread through him. "That's right. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't matter." As he continued walking, Jamal realized that his journey had come full circle. He was no longer invisible, no longer living in the shadows. He had stood up, faced his fears, and emerged with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. And in doing so, he had found not only justice but a community that would always remember his fight. For the first time in his life, Jamal felt truly at peace. The struggle had been worth it, and he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. His story would live on, a testament to resilience, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. Months had passed since the trial, and Jamal's life had changed in ways he'd never imagined. His days were now filled with purpose, the kind of purpose he hadn't thought possible for someone like him. Every morning, he walked into Daniel's company, a place that had quickly become more than just a job. It was a second chance, a fresh start, a place where he could stand tall and know he was valued. The city, once an intimidating maze that pushed him to the edges, now felt like a home he had reclaimed piece by piece. He had friends, colleagues, and even strangers who saw him as a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience against the forces that had tried to silence him. He no longer walked alone, and each day, he felt that quiet truth settle deeper into his heart. One crisp fall morning, Jamal stood in a bright, clean conference room, giving a presentation to a room full of colleagues. He still found it hard to believe he was here, a part of something, his voice echoing in a place of respect and opportunity. As he spoke, he saw nods of encouragement, and he felt a warmth spreading through him, a confidence, a feeling of belonging that had been so long denied to him. After the meeting, Daniel approached him, a proud smile lighting up his face. "You're a natural, Jamal. The team appreciates you, and so do I. I knew you'd be a great addition." Jamal felt a deep gratitude, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything. I never thought this would be possible." Daniel gave him a firm pat on the back. "You made it possible. You fought your way here, and we're all better for it." Later that afternoon, Jamal took a walk to clear his mind, his feet leading him toward a part of the city he hadn't visited in a long time. He passed by the closed-up storefront where his life had changed, where he had first encountered Walker, and he paused, letting the memories wash over him. But today, there was no bitterness in his heart. No resentment. Instead, he felt a quiet triumph, a reminder that he had overcome, that he had risen above the dark moments to claim his life. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard someone call his name. He turned to see a small group of people gathered nearby, a few familiar faces from the trial, people who had supported him and believed in him when the outcome was uncertain. One woman, holding the hand of her young son, approached him with a grateful smile. "Jamal, I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you, my son knows that he doesn't have to accept disrespect from anyone, no matter who they are." Jamal smiled, kneeling down to meet the boy's wide-eyed gaze. "Remember, kid," he said gently, "you have a voice. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small. Stand up for yourself, and stand up for others. There's power in that." The boy nodded, his eyes filled with admiration, and Jamal felt a surge of hope. If his journey, his fight, could inspire even one person to stand up, to believe in their worth, then every moment of struggle had been worth it. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the city, Jamal continued his walk, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He thought back to everyone who had helped him along the way: Daniel,
Sandra,
Officer Grant, and even the strangers who had shown him kindness when he felt most alone. He thought about the late nights he'd spent wondering if he would ever belong, if his life would ever hold meaning.
now,
He knew the answer. He had found purpose,
community,
and a strength he hadn't known he possessed. And as he looked out over the bustling city, he saw himself in the faces of the people rushing past, each of them a reminder that everyone has a story, everyone deserves to be seen. Over time, Jamal became an advocate for others, speaking out for those who were often silenced, sharing his story to show people that they
2,
had a voice. He volunteered at shelters, joined community groups, and eventually, he was asked to speak at events, inspiring others to stand up for justice and dignity. Each story he heard, each life he touched, deepened his commitment to making a difference. He became a familiar face in the city, not as the man sitting alone on the steps, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. People from all walks of life reached out to him, sharing their own struggles and thanking him for his courage. He had become part of something bigger than himself, a legacy that he was proud to carry forward. One evening, as he returned to his small but cozy apartment, he looked around at the simple furniture, the framed photos of friends and family, and the life he had built. It wasn't grand, but it was his, a testament to his journey from survival to belonging. Standing by the window, watching the city lights blink to life in the dusk, he felt a profound sense of peace. He was no longer the man the world had tried to ignore. He was Jamal Thompson, a man who had found his voice, who had fought for his dignity, and who had learned that he could stand up and be seen. As he turned away from the window, he knew that his journey was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, lives to uplift, and stories to be heard.
but now,
He faced the future with an open heart, ready to walk forward with strength
hope,
and the unwavering belief that every person deserved to be valued. And, in that quiet moment, he whispered a promise to himself, a promise to keep going, to keep believing, and to keep fighting for a world where everyone could stand tall.